Welcome everyone to our final webinar for Integrity Week 2020. I'm joined today by our production coordinator, Helen Pethrick, and our special guest presenters, Catherine Kinnear and Jennifer Sinclair. We'll begin today with a territorial acknowledgement to acknowledge that we are joining you today from Treaty 7 territory in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that we're also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So I'll pass it over now to Jennifer and to Catherine to talk to us about FOIP considerations in academic integrity. Go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks all for attending today. I'm Catherine Kinnear. I'm the FOIP coordinator here at the university, and I'm joined by my colleague Jennifer Sinclair, who is a FOIP advisor here. We are going to basically switch presenting duties about halfway through. So Jennifer will be starting us off. And as Sarah said, please chime in at any time with questions through the chat function. And we're happy to stop at any time if there's a particular question you'd like addressed. So Jennifer's going to pull up our screen, our presentation, excuse me.
I'm just waiting for Sarah to let me share my screen, and then I'm good to go.
Jennifer, you have co-host privileges, so you should be able to share your screen. On the bottom of your floating taskbar on the bottom of your screen, you should see an option to share your screen.
Sorry, oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Can everybody see that all right?
That looks great. Please go ahead.
Perfect. So as Catherine mentioned, my name is Jennifer Sinclair. I'm part of our FOIP team. So I'm going to cover the first half of the presentation, and then Catherine's going to take over and cover the second half. So in the first half, we're going to give you a very brief, very basic outline of what is FOIP. So you may have heard the acronym FOIP. It's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy. What it refers to is the legislation that governs Alberta public sector. We'll get more into that. So by the end of this session, you should be able to understand the impact of the Freedom of Information sorry, just moving people down. Understand the impact of the FOIP Act on the university policies and procedures, and also understand the FOIP principles as they relate to the academic integrity issues in the academic integrity realm. The chat, Sarah's going to monitor them. She'll interject, and then we also have a few points throughout the presentation where we can go ahead and jump on them. So back to what is FOIP. FOIP is provincial legislation that applies to all post-secondary since 1999. The FOIP Act came into effect originally in 1995. At that point, it was really, really narrow, the scope of it. It only applied to municipal improvement boards and a few other organizations. In 1999, it was expanded to apply to post-secondary institutions. As employees of the publicly funded body, we must comply with FOIP. That is our privacy legislation. So what does FOIP do? FOIP has two different components. It has an access portion and it has a privacy portion. For the most part, we're going to deal with the access portion in this presentation. But just as a brief rundown, the access portion deals with the how to request records, what do we do with those records, how do we govern the way we collect, use, and disclose that personal information. So the FOIP Act in its entirety is approximately 80 pages.
Jennifer, I'm going to interject.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but your audio, there's a little bit of a lag. So this may be improved if you turn off your camera while you're speaking, because your audio was a little choppy. Sorry to interrupt.
So it jumped ahead a little. But
Your audio
there's
is better.
5 provisions of the FOIP Act. 5. Audio's better?
Yes, it is.
There are 5 purposes of the FOIP Act: to allow persons the right of access to records in the custody or control of the university, control the manner in which the university uses information. Individuals, as always, have a right to access the personal information that's about themselves, as well as correct the information about themselves. And individuals do have a right to an independent review at any time. So you'll note 2 keywords that seem to repeat themselves through all those purposes are custody or control. So what does custody and control mean? That is explicitly outlined in the FOIP Act. Custody means that the university or an employee are strictly carrying out a work-related activity, and we have physical custody of that record. So that includes if it's in an employee's filing cabinet, a central filing system on our premises. I'm thinking working papers in an employee's desk, electronic records located on your desktop or your personal drive. That is what the Act means by custody. Control means that the university may not have physical custody of the record, but we still have the authority to manage what happens to the record. So that includes restricting, regulating, how it's used, can it be disclosed, what happens when we're done with the record. That could also be records created by the university for work-related purposes, or records stored on a personal device, such as a smartphone, notepad, iPad of the employee, but it's university business. So the best example I can give of this is, say, the architectural plans for the McKimmie Tower redevelopment. Now, I don't specifically have details on those, but I would assume that the big drawings are probably in the custody of the architectural firm, just because of their sheer size. So those may not be in the university's custody. However, they are in our control. If required, we could ask the architectural firm or the engineers to produce those. We could decide when they needed to destroy those records. That's what's meant by control. The other key point that runs throughout those 5 purposes is the collection of personal information. There are strict standards of how the university may collect, use, or disclose personal information. The provision we most often rely on is that the information is collected because it is necessary for an operating program of the public body. That is what 99% of the information collected by the university falls under. And that's the only way that FOIP lets us collect that personal information. If we use that personal information for any other purpose, we could get in trouble with the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, and you can't repurpose that personal information for any other reason. So just giving a brief interlude into the academic integrity side, if we are collecting personal information from the student as part of their enrollment into a program, that's compliant with necessary for an operating program of the public body. If we then use that as part of an investigation into an academic misconduct, that is also compliant because Part A relates directly to Part B. If we were then to use that same information and pass it through to a different office on campus to solicit donations for an event or to invite them to a guest speaker series, that is not compliant. Catherine will cover that more in the later slides, but just to give you an idea. So now we're caught up to the presentation. What is personal information? You'll hear personal information repeated. I just repeated it numerous times. It's recorded information about an identifiable individual. So name, address, email, phone, anything on this slide is considered personal information. One interesting caveat that we seem to run into in FOIP and seems to become more prevalent in the academic integrity realm is the last 2 bullet points. Your personal information is yours, unless it is about another person, in which case it is their personal information. and they do have a right of access to that. So I know that's a little bit of a gray area. So just to put that in context, if I was making statements about Catherine, it's my personal information. But if it's about Catherine, it then becomes her personal information and she has an access to it. So that's one of those items that we advise a little note of caution on. And again, Catherine's going to cover it later, but be factual in what you're writing down, because if it is about another person, it then becomes their personal information and they have a right of access to it. Exceptions to disclosure. So although somebody has a right to access their personal information, that is not a guaranteed right in all circumstances. So as a brief synopsis of the FOIP process, if you've ever been involved in a FOIP process, you'll know the FOIP office receives an access to information request. It's also known as a FOIP request, access request, information request. They're all synonymous. We receive that in the FOIP office. We then reach out to units or departments that we believe have knowledge of the material or have been identified in the request, and we gather all those records. Those records could be electronic records, those records could be hard copy records, those records could be Post-it notes, or even meeting notes written in personal calendars. If it is in the custody again, or the control of the university, we have a right to collect that information. Once that information is received by the FOIP office, we then do a fulsome review of it line by line by line. At that point, this is where the exceptions to disclosure apply. While reviewing that material, we go through, there's 15 sections of the FOIP Act that say you may disclose this information or you must not disclose this information. If there was information in there, which is personal information that we covered on the previous slide, so name, sex, gender, marital status, that information is disclosure harmful to personal privacy, it's not disclosed. If there was evaluations on someone's mental health, if we determined that it was harmful to the individual, their own, or to someone around them, or to public safety to disclose that information. So possibly plans on how the university would react in the event of an armed assailant, we could refuse to disclose that as it would be harmful to the individual or the public safety as a whole. Advice to or from officials. This comes up more in the academic integrity realm. What's that meant to cover is if an instructor reports to the dean that there's a suspected issue of plagiarism or academic misconduct. They are seeking advice from the official, being the dean, and the dean is in a position to make something happen from that. They can make disciplinary happen. They can instigate an investigation. That is what is meant by officials. It's to protect the request from employees seeking assistance or providing their input to officials. And the last one being privileged information. There are certain cases where you may see privileged information. That is strictly information that goes between the university legal counsel and departments. So it may be the chair of the board involved in an academic misconduct seeking assistance of the solicitor on how to proceed, process questions procedurally. That information is also an exception to disclosure. With the exception of the first one, personal privacy, that is a mandatory. We have no discretion on that. If the information falls into that category, so name, sex, gender, marital status, it is a mandatory disclosure. We cannot disclose that information under any circumstance. If it falls into the next 3 bullet points, the individual or public safety, the solicitor client, or the advice to officials, those are discretionary exemptions. We may choose to disclose that information. We may choose to not disclose that information. You'll note drafts do not constitute an exception to disclosure if it is written, if it is recorded, not if it's floating in your mind, but if it is written, if it is recorded, it is something that we can absolutely disclose. And embarrassment does not constitute an exception. Sometimes people write things that the recipient would understand, but when it comes to a broader audience, they don't understand. It doesn't come across the same way. Catherine's going to cover that a little bit more, but that's another one of those suggestions of embarrassment does not constitute an exception. So we like to say, when you're writing something, keep in mind, how would you feel if tomorrow this ended up on the Globe and Mail? If this was on the front page of CBC, would you be able to stand behind it and explain it? Or is it something that you should probably put in a phone call or something that you should, regardless, just not say? Anything I missed there, Catherine?
No, all good.
Okay. So student information. This is something that the registrar gets requested for quite frequently. So it's actually covered in the privacy policy. Section 4 of the privacy policy does explicitly state this if you do need a reference, but it is not an unreasonable invasion of privacy to disclose the following information about a student. So there are dates of registration, faculty department, degree diploma awarded from UCalgary, convocation dates, if they're attending or they have attended any public events, public event being a graduation, sporting or cultural event, not if they're attending specific classes or anything to that degree. Just because we're saying, yes, they're registered at the University of Calgary, that does not give us permission to then say they're enrolled in the fall 2020 semester and here's the classes they're taking, here's their GPA. It's a very broad overview. Yes, they're enrolled here. They're enrolled in this faculty. They did receive a diploma or their expected convocation date. We most often see this when during politics. We often get calls, did this politician attend your university, or that vetting process. That's what the registrar sees as most often, but you can feel empowered to release this information if you were requested. Anything else must be carefully considered. If you're unclear, absolutely send it over to our FOIP office. Most often from the student directly. If you know that it's being requested from the student, you can feel empowered to release directly to the student. From a course instructor or a student advisor, a little bit more caution. Do they have a need to know? Why do they need this information? Is it necessary for them to do their operating program? Again, feel free to send it over to the FOIP office and we can ensure that everything is what needs to be. The registrar, if the registrar needs the information, again, you can provide it. And the student's parent or legal counsel, we often get situations where the student's parents has called in and said, my son or daughter, I don't know that they're attending class, or how are they doing with their GPA? That is not something you can share. There are processes in place with the registrar's office where a student can provide consent for that information to be shared with their parent, but that's absolutely a situation where you can send them over to the registrar's office, and the registrar's office will take care of making sure that they have the appropriate documentation for that. Employee information, which can be closed. Again, very similar. Employment status, your business contact information. So your business, your office location, your university telephone number, your job title, maybe your job profile, that can all be released. Your salary range and discretionary benefits can be released, and that is only the range. The exact number is not something that can be disclosed unless you are part of the Sunshine List, in which case, unfortunately, that legislation is prevalent and that information will show up on the Sunshine List. So it's considered publicly available, which is personal information already in that public domain. Publications listed in an academic staff member's annual report, that is disclosable as well. Again, anything else must be carefully considered. And you can ask the FOIP office if you're unclear on that. So this is an engagement portion. Does anyone have a particular instance in which they felt information was overshared or unavailable to them? Feel free to put it into the chat. Sarah's going to feed those questions to both Catherine and I.
We don't have any questions or comments at this time, but I'll continue to monitor the chat and welcome any contributions that participants have.
Good. Then I will rely on Jennifer to switch slides for me, and we'll talk a little more about the records side of things, which is always a big consideration. So at any institution, we are all constantly creating records. And why do we do it? We do it to fulfill legal requirements. We do it to jog our memories because we need to have some sort of evidence of the decision that we took, which led to the conclusion of a project or an action taken regarding a student or an employee. We do it to remember details. We all have much too much information to deal with. So when you record that information, it allows you to hark back to it when it's needed. And we create records to document the process, because having a consistent process, repeatable over time, is obviously always a good practice. The FOIP Act in Alberta does not impose an obligation on the university to create a record. So in this province, there's no duty to document. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but here the FOIP Act does not say to us at any time, you must create this record. It leaves it up to us to use our discretion when a record should be created. Having said that, we shouldn't avoid creating a record that would be needed by the organization simply because we're worried that at some time in the future, we might have to produce the record because a FOIP request has been filed. So there's no duty to document, but it's within all of our discretion, using our expertise, depending on the sort of job we do, to make those decisions. And often we're just making them unconsciously. Day in, day out, we're all creating records. As Jennifer mentioned, when a FOIP request is filed, all that can be accessed in a FOIP request are records that exist at that particular time. So that's where records management comes in. We'll talk about that in a moment. We love to say create records with access in mind. That's kind of a slogan of our office and probably every similar office in the country. We always want to record the most objective, high-level evidence that we possibly can of any sort of wrongdoing, poor behavior, be it an academic misconduct issue or a non-academic misconduct issue. We want to be as honest, but high level, and to record things in a very careful and a very deliberate manner. If the issue is confidential or if it's legal advice, as Jennifer mentioned, it is entirely appropriate, and in fact, it's terrific if that's flagged on the document. So we always ask people to think about, in an email, for example, either put confidential or privileged or for advice, for review. If there's a descriptor you can put front and center on that document, it makes it much easier for people looking at the document after the fact to start making decisions about whether or not it's appropriate for release. As Jennifer said, we always remind people to assume that someone's going to ask for the information, be it a photograph, an email, a text. I should say that, no surprise, probably, I don't know, 80 or 90% of the records that we end up reviewing in response to FOIP requests tend to be emails. And the great thing about emails is that they're immediate, they're easily written and sent out. The not so great thing about emails is that they're easily written and easily sent out. And furthermore, they're easily forwarded. So it is so important that we all take a moment to look at any email to do with a situation such as an academic or a non-academic misconduct issue. Look at it for a moment before you hit send. I should also say, it's an excellent idea, as I mentioned, to indicate what sort of a document it is. If it's confidential, put that flag on in your email system, or just write confidential at the top of it. And keep in mind that confidentiality of a document can change over time. So something might be confidential at the moment when you write it, but maybe in several years when the issue has been resolved, it might not be confidential anymore. And that's something we see a fair amount. Also, if something passes into the public domain through no fault of our own, it might become impossible for us to consider it confidential and keep it from disclosure. What we would prefer people don't record. And it's something that certainly has caused some embarrassment for us in the past. And I know that all my counterparts in other Canadian universities have had the exact same sort of scenarios. We want to avoid unsubstantiated subjective evaluations that require expertise you don't have. And a classic example is that in a conversation, it's very easy to make a flip comment describing someone in an unflattering way. But once you record that in the form of an email or even a text or whatever format the record might take, it becomes something that the person could access in the future. And it doesn't do any good for the institution or for the individual making the FOIP request to record opinions that really don't have any basis in fact or expertise. We always try and avoid humor, sarcasm, derogatory comments, and that can be challenging because sometimes in the heat of the moment, it's all too easy to write an email which might be inappropriate. So again, it's important to keep in mind that humor doesn't translate well. It might seem unprofessional. It might lower the tone of the email that you're writing. We've had some funny examples and the sort of thing that we discourage people from recording. We had one person who wrote something to their to their associate dean, and it was something to the effect of, "Why do I get all the cheaters? Why are they always in my class?" Which verbally might be kind of humorous, and you know, you can certainly understand where that is coming from. But when it's written down in an email, and that email is going to last for years and years and years, it just doesn't translate very well. So it's just a reminder to be careful when you're recording information. Be as conscious of it as you possibly can. So, as I said, be factual, be specific. Less is always more. Remember to mark the communication as confidential or privileged or for action, for review, for advice. If you are the person who's going to be keeping a copy of that record, think about how you're going to keep it. We want to reduce duplication as much as possible, and it's a huge problem at every institution. Records management, unfortunately, is not the most, it's extremely important, but it's not always the best resourced function in a university. So I think we rely a lot on individuals to make good record keeping decisions. So if you're going to keep a copy of something, don't keep a paper copy and an electronic copy. Make a decision, be consistent, and keep one or the other, and minimize it as much as possible. Yeah. Oh yeah, and actually that's something I'll just quickly mention, which is that in the context of a FOIP request, generally a student asking for records that were related to their appeal, it's not just the actual appeal file records that the student might ask for. They can ask for absolutely anything you can imagine. They can name people, they could name a department or a faculty. The scope can be really broad. So it's just a reminder for all of us to respect people's privacy as much as possible. Collect as little information as possible, only the information that's absolutely necessary to do the job. Anything extraneous, try not to make a record out of it.
Catherine, may I interrupt? We've had a question come in that I think might be a good time to ask.
Of course.
So Tu's asking a question, and it's relating to international students. And when international students sort of disappear, sort of go missing in action, if you will, from our campuses. And if a parent reaches out who's living outside Canada to the university looking for help to locate their child, and in one case, anecdotally, the university refused on the basis of confidentiality. And so the question is, what could the university and or the family members do in such a case?
So that's true, actually. I'm not sure if I'm thinking of the same example that Tu's thinking of, but all of our students, regardless of if it's an international student or a Canadian student, regardless of their age, because we will treat a student, even if they're only 16 or 17 years old, we treat all our students as if they are adults. It's sort of an informal application of the mature minor philosophy, even though that's not actually part of our FOIP legislation. But we can't disclose information about the student to the parent without the student's consent. Now, before the fact, before the parent had a concern about the student disappearing, students always have the option of completing a form through our registrar's office, which gives someone, be it a parent or a spouse or a sibling, access to their information and a certain degree of latitude in posing questions and getting information. If that wasn't done, then we are really quite stuck. There's a couple ways a parent could go about it. If they genuinely feared that something untoward had happened to the student, they could bring campus security into it. Campus security might have a bit more latitude to operate. They could call local police. They might have more latitude to operate. And when we bring in law enforcement, the FOIP Act might allow us to disclose more information because it's a law enforcement scenario than we would otherwise. In a more informal way, something that we might do, and I'm going to phrase this carefully because I don't want it to sound as if we're rogue actors, if that's a good way to phrase it, but informally, we might try and look behind the scenes to see if there's anything we can find out that might reassure the parent. Maybe we can contact the student and just say, reach out, call your parents, send them an email. If we have a genuine worry that something untoward's happened to the student, then we would absolutely intervene and we would take action ourselves based on the information in our custody.
That's helpful. Thank you. It also speaks to the extent to which parents are allowed to access students' information, which may differ in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, that's very true. It's here, unless there's a signed consent from the student, parents find it very frustrating, but we can't tell them anything.
Great, thanks for that. That's the only question we have at this time.
Great. So very quickly, this issue of perception of bias, it was raised in a couple of previous training sessions. And so obviously it's something on people's minds. And it's just a reminder that in your personal life, and especially where social media is concerned, we all want to be extremely careful, because even though you might perceive yourself to be acting as an individual completely apart from your role as a university employee, those two worlds can collide. So we always want to remind people to be careful, just keep your personal social media completely free of work-related information, a bit of a danger zone. Years ago, we have had unfortunate scenarios where people have put information on social media and then it crosses over into the university sphere, and it's those are hard situations to sort out. So we'd rather avoid them altogether if we possibly can. And obviously, if somebody is sitting on an appeal board or is participating in an investigation into an academic or non-academic misconduct, you don't ever want to have that kind of information tainting your actions in your role investigating or considering an appeal. Very quickly, security issues. More good reminders. Voicemail, for example, that's something which strangely would be accessible under a FOIP request. And we have had people specifically ask for voicemails. Our advice is always just delete the voicemail, jot down the phone number if you need to, and then call the person back. Also, when you're leaving the voicemail, don't fill it up with all sorts of detail about the incident that you might be calling about, because we've also had scenarios where maybe in the case of somebody's admin assistant, they have access to their manager or their supervisor's voicemail, they can pick it up, and there's no guarantee that the person picking up the voicemail is the person it was intended for. So just a good reminder to say as little as possible when you leave a voicemail. Texts, IMs, Skype, Microsoft Teams is something we're using a lot more in the last year or two at this university. All of those methods of communication are easily misinterpreted. So we need to be very careful with humor, derogatory, keeping it as high level and professional as we possibly can. At this university, I think there might be some people listening in today that aren't from University of Calgary, but here we have a chat function in our Microsoft Teams system. And those records at the moment are kept indefinitely, which in my opinion is a dangerous practice, because those records aren't intended to be permanent long-term records. A lot of them truly are transitory conversations that are really needed for 5 or 10 minutes and then should be deleted. So that's something I hope we're going to be able to address. That's just the way the system is by default, I believe. But just a reminder that every time you're generating a record in one of those electronic systems, it's being retained. And so you want to be very careful. Communicating in person, by extension, is often the most appropriate way to talk about something highly sensitive. If you don't need a written record of a conversation, it might just be best to do it verbally.
May I interject, because I've had another question come in that might be particularly relevant at this time. It's a question that came in privately to me, and it's a question about, as we're working in online environments, synchronous environments like Zoom and Microsoft Teams. So with a shift to online learning and working, many conversations are happening in forms that can keep a record either to the knowledge of the people being recorded, such as today, or may not be immediately evident to the person that they're being recorded. So if there's no option to have an in-person conversation. So what might be some strategies to manage conversations that might be on the record or off the record and recording about academic misconduct when we're working and learning and teaching online?
So that is an excellent question. And actually, when we adopted Zoom for the wide scale implementation back in March, we had a lot of discussions about that. And we put, there's quite a lot of responsibility on the person who is hosting the meeting to make those decisions. The host of the meeting has access to all the default settings. And so case in point, it's the host's responsibility. If they're going to be recording that meeting, they should be telling everybody involved in the meeting at the outset that it's going to be recorded. The host is also responsible for switching off the ability to record by participants. So that's another important thing. In our MS Teams, there are those same defaults. Again, the host should be setting them in advance. And also I go a step further, and I would say that when you send out the invitation to, for example, a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting or a class, if you're planning to record, put that in the invitation so it's abundantly clear. Where teaching is concerned, for example, it should be in the course outline so that students know it's going to be recorded, it's going to be posted on D2L, or whatever your learning management system is. So the host does bear a fair amount of responsibility. Now, this is testing my memory. In one of the systems, I'm not sure if it's Teams or Zoom, I'm fairly sure it's Teams, there actually is a message that'll pop up briefly at the top of the screen saying this is being recorded. So if unfortunately somebody forgot to tell everybody, they're also going to see that visually that it's being recorded. Our general advice is, for the vast majority on the administrative side, so appeals and things like that, the vast majority of meetings that we hold at the university don't need to be recorded. And my position will always be, if it needs to be recorded, you need to figure out, make your decisions clear and deliberate, why you would want to record it, how long it's going to be kept for, what's the purpose, who's going to have access to it. They shouldn't be off the cuff decisions that you make 2 minutes into the meeting. These should be things that you've thought out in advance. And one other thing I'll very quickly say about Zoom and Teams is, although Zoom is a wonderful product and we are blessed to have it as our main teaching tool, we do not allow recording restricted conversations that have restricted information in them. This university, we have an information classification standard. And basically, hypothetically, there are 4 different types of information. So there's public information, internal use information, confidential information, and restricted. Restricted is a very small category. And the big one that we're most conscious of is identifiable personal health information. Those conversations should never, ever be recorded with Zoom. That's this university's policy. And I will say other universities are fine with it. Alberta Health Services uses Zoom for those sorts of conversations, but here that was a conscious decision we made because we believe that Teams offers a higher level of security. So if you're having a conversation with something really highly, highly, highly confidential, we would probably suggest you use Teams as opposed to Zoom.
Thanks for that.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there. So managing records.
Catherine, may I interject for one moment?
Oh, yeah.
Just another following up on what Catherine has said. In some situations, specifically, I would say if you're recording a session such as this and minors are involved, that's been popping up more and more where there have been online engagement opportunities where maybe youth are under the age of 18 are dealing with mentors or any of those situations. I would recommend you get in touch with the FOIP office because we may go a step further and do consent forms. Just to reiterate, the student, because they're under the age of 18, may not understand what that recording across the top, you are being recorded, means. So we might go a step further and say, we need this consent form signed by a guardian, and it reiterates, you're being recorded. It's going to be posted on our D2L site or maybe an external outreach site for the purposes of, for this amount of time. So just, I would exercise that caution if any of your recordings involve anyone under the age of 18, that we may need to go a step further.
That's helpful. Thank you.
That is. Thank you, Jennifer. And also, especially under 13, there's a bit of a sort of an unwritten rule, 13 and under, all the more sensitive. And then 13 to 16, 16 to 18, there are sort of various degrees of sensitivity there. So thank you for mentioning that. Back to managing records. Our process, our practice at this university is that the chair of a board or committee who is looking into an academic misconduct issue is responsible for setting the rules for how the records are going to be kept. They might be kept within a SharePoint site, which we like because it's got a very high level of security attached to it. It might be kept in a dedicated system such as Maxion, which is used by our student conduct office. But somebody has to take that administrative role to make the decisions about how the records are going to be managed longer term. One of the things that, harking back to trying to minimize duplication of documents, which is always a problem, we always recommend that at the end of an appeal process, for example, the chair reminds everybody who was involved in the process to provide all of the records they may have accumulated over the course of the process up to the chair. And then it's the chair's responsibility to sort out the duplicates, to decide what is the important and accurate record of the proceeding, keep all of those documents, delete the documents that aren't of longer term importance or that were just sort of transitory communications such as setting up a meeting time or some such thing that don't really add anything to the important meat of the issue at hand. So it reduces duplication, and also it allows the university to have one consistent, accurate, reliable record, as opposed to things scattered all over between various units or faculties, which is very problematic if somebody files a FOIP request. So at this university, we have a master records retention schedule, which goes by that acronym MARS. Every university has got something similar. So there are always retention rules, which give you the guideline for how long specific types of information need to be kept. And then there are also guidelines for general information. And for example, drafts, working materials, temporary information, that sort of thing, it's all of our individual responsibility to keep on top of those documents. You don't need to keep those sorts of things any longer than the time frame in which they actually are being actively used. So if it's just a quick decision being made and you're not going to need to refer back to it in a month or a year or 10 years, then you should just delete it when you know it's served its purpose and it's never going to be needed again. We, as I said a moment ago, we always encourage people to clean up their records at the conclusion of any sort of a project or a process or an appeal or an investigation. Not everything is worth keeping. And one of the downsides of our wonderful electronic world is that it's far too easy to keep absolutely everything that you've ever made a record of. And we would strongly encourage you, some people say there's that, I can't remember if it's a 2 or 5% rule, that 2 or 5% of the records we create are actually significant enough to merit keeping. So it's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. Apply the retention rules that the university has created, and on your own, take initiative periodically to go through your transitory and draft materials and get rid of them as quickly as you can. There's a liability associated with keeping too many records. And there's also a liability with not keeping records. So that's just the way it is. I think we're almost at the end, so good timing. We just put some links onto various policies at the university that are relevant to this discussion. And if there are any questions, we still have about 10 minutes, so I'm certainly happy to hang about for a while. Jennifer and I are very happy to talk with you, entertain any questions. If there's strange, specific scenarios that you've come across, we love to hear about them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was an informative and content-packed presentation. I hope it's been useful for everyone who's here. Now's the time for the participants. If you have questions or comments, please do type them into the chat box. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I had a question for both of you, and it kind of builds a little bit on what you were talking about earlier about how things have changed during our pivot to remote learning, teaching, working. And I wondered if you might have any additional tips or thoughts to share about privacy and information in this new normal that we're all working in. I know you touched on a few points, but was there anything that you might want to expand on, particularly as it might pertain to academic integrity? And I'll go a step further and say, you know, we find now students making comments about academic integrity matters on Reddit, and even professors in social media, either whether it's their opinion or how they intend to proceed in their classes. And I wondered if you could make a comment about that at all.
Aside from please don't do that.
That might be the message, and it's okay to hear that over again and again and again.
Yes, and that, you know, you're absolutely right. Since lockdown in mid-March, we've seen more and more of that sort of thing, and it's a huge problem because obviously we don't control Reddit. We can't prevent our students from posting things, and also those things are always posted under some sort of a pseudonym, so we can't even attribute them necessarily to the actual author. So that has definitely increased. And that goes hand in hand with Zoom bombing and people writing stupid, harassing things in a chat during a class. Of course, there's been a rise in that as well. And it's quite difficult to deal with because there are unfortunately limitations in trying to identify people. And we have tried different settings in Zoom, for example, to resolve those problems. But it's an interesting thing because you'll change a setting, for example, not allowing people to change from their name, change their name to a pseudonym. And we thought at one point, well, that's a good way to prevent those sorts of incidents where people are writing harassing comments in the chat. But then we realized that if we turn that off, we are putting students who, for example, transgender students who maybe want to have be identified by a different name during their courses. They want to use a preferred name. Well, we're putting them at a disadvantage if we turn that off completely. So it's an ongoing challenge. And it's also an ongoing challenge to try and identify people. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jennifer? I'm
sorry to put you on the spot. And if you don't have it, the message in itself of don't do that is always helpful.
Yeah.
I would echo that. It's the don't do that, but also you are able to ask. So I was in a situation, to give you an example, a few weeks ago where I started a Zoom meeting. Halfway through a Zoom meeting, there was a bunch of people. Somebody I didn't realize had left the meeting and then rejoined the meeting under a different name. It wasn't a name anyone recognized. So we actually stopped the meeting. And what it had turned out was that somebody was using their Zoom. Their Zoom went down, so they reconnected under their husband's account. But to us, it was just a random name that happened to join our chat. So in those situations, just a good check-in, is everybody still here? Is anybody having connectivity issues? In our case, somebody spoke up and said, oh yes, here's the situation. It worked, but Zoom bombing is a thing. People have been doing that for fun. So it is just a good idea to check periodically.
And actually, one thing I should quickly mention is that, we tried various things and finally it was decided that with Zoom bombing, with the, harassing comments in chat during a class, those sorts of incidents should be reported straight to campus security because we wanted to have a centralized process for dealing with these things because they really are highly inappropriate. So campus security is the place to go. And that's where we direct students to as well if they encounter any of those sorts of things.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you for that. And we haven't had too many questions come in or too many comments, so we can probably wrap up here. Just kind of wanted to give you the floor for any closing remarks or reflections before we wrap up the session.
Call us anytime. Less is more. Keep access in mind every time you write something down. Think about it being on the Globe and Mail splash page. That's probably our closing comments. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, as always, for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us. I think this is a really important topic, particularly for those who handle academic misconduct case files. And it's one that we don't talk about enough. And I know you've done this session for us a number of times, and I always learn something when you come to join us. So thank you again. We're so appreciative of you sharing your knowledge with the University of Calgary community and beyond.
Thanks. Bye-bye.